The air inside the diner carried the faint scent of burnt coffee and grease, clinging to the worn checkered floors and faded red booths. David Carter pushed through the glass door, his olive green coat pulled tight around him, the fabric frayed at the cuffs from years of wear. The place was nearly deserted, a hollow kind of quiet hanging over it. Only a handful of souls occupied the space, an older man hunched over a cup of black coffee. In the far corner, a middle-aged woman flipping through a magazine near the window, and the waitress, a weary figure with tired eyes, propped against the counter, her nose buried in a crinkled newspaper. David offered her a small nod, a gesture born of habit rather than expectation, and made his way to a small table tucked in the corner by a streaked window. He eased into the chair, the vinyl creaking under his weight, and rested his hands on the scratched wooden surface, fingers tracing the grooves absently. A quick glance at his watch told him his son, Ryan, was late again, but David didn't mind. Waiting was a skill he'd honed over decades, a quiet patience carved into him by a life that demanded resilience. He felt the eyes on him almost immediately. Subtle, fleeting glances darted his way from the other patrons, little pinpricks of scrutiny that reminded him of where he was, a mostly white diner, in a part of town he rarely ventured into. The weight of those looks settled on his shoulders, familiar yet unwelcome. Like an old coat he couldn't quite shrug off, he pushed the feeling aside, letting it dissolve into the background noise of his thoughts. Just another day, he told himself, another cup of coffee in another town. Raising a hand, he caught the waitress's attention. She ambled over, her expression blank as a slate, her apron stained with faint traces of ketchup and coffee spills. "Just a coffee, please," David said, his voice soft but steady, accompanied by a polite smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. She nodded, barely meeting his gaze, and poured the dark liquid into a chipped white mug before retreating without so much as a word. David wrapped his hands around the cup, savoring the heat seeping into his palms, and let his eyes drift over the zenith faint hum of a radio in the kitchen, the dull clink of a spoon against porcelain, the gray light filtering through the window. For a moment, he felt almost at peace. The chime of the diner's door shattered that fragile calm. David glanced over his shoulder, catching sight of a new figure stepping in, a police officer, tall and imposing, his broad shoulders filling the doorway. The man's face was a hard mask, etched with a permanent scowl, his eyes sharp and searching as they swept the room. They landed on David and lingered there, heavy and unyielding. The officer didn't hesitate. He strode forward, his boots thudding against the linoleum floor with deliberate force, each step echoing like a drumbeat in the stillness. He stopped at David's table, arms crossing over his chest, casting a long shadow that swallowed the faint light spilling across David's coffee. "You lost or something?" the officer asked, his voice rough, laced with a jagged edge that cut through the quiet. David lifted his gaze, meeting the man's stare with a calm that belied the tension coiling in his gut. "Just waiting for my son," he replied, his tone even, as if the question were nothing more than small talk. But he knew better. That Tenethi thinly veiled hostility was an old song, one he'd heard too many times to count. The officer's brow creased, skepticism flickering across his face. "Your son, huh?" He let out a sharp, dismissive snort, his eyes darting around the diner as if searching for evidence to contradict David's words. "Don't see too many folks like you around here. How long you planning on waiting?" David raised the mug to his lips, taking a slow sip, letting the bitter warmth steady him before he answered. "As long as it takes, officer." The response was simple, measured, but it seemed to ignite something in the man looming over him. The officer scoffed, his lips twisting into a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. "This isn't the place for loitering. People get nervous, you know." David held his gaze, unflinching. "I'm not here to bother anyone, just having coffee." The officer leaned in closer, his shadow growing darker, his voice dropping to a low growl. "Let me see some ID, old man." David's chest tightened, but his face remained a mask of composure. He met the officer's eyes for a long moment, then reached into the pocket of his coat, fingers brushing against the worn leather of his wallet. He pulled out his veteran ID, the edges slightly bent from years of being carried, and handed it over without a word. The officer snatched it, barely glancing at the detail's name, the service record, the faded photo before tossing it back onto the table with a sneer. It landed with a soft thud, skittering toward the edge. A vet. Not sure I'm buying it, the officer said, his tone thick with mockery, disbelief dripping from every syllable. You think some idea is enough to make you belong here? David didn't flinch, didn't let the barbs sink in. Believe it or don't, he said quietly, I know who I am. The officer's laugh was harsh, a jagged sound that bounced off the diner's walls and drew uneasy glances from the other patrons. Yeah, and I know the type acting all polite, pretending you're somebody. David felt a flicker of irritation flare in his chest, a spark threatening to catch, but he tamped it down, keeping his voice steady. You got a problem with me, officer? The man leaned in even closer, his breath hot and sour, his words a hissed whisper. Problem? My problem is folks like you thinking you can walk in wherever you want, thinking you're entitled to respect. You're out of place, and I don't take kindly to people like you pushing their luck. David's jaw clenched, the muscles tightening as he fought to keep his composure. I'm just a man having coffee, he said, his voice low, almost a murmur. Not looking for trouble. Trouble finds you, though, doesn't it? The officer's sneer widened, his eyes glinting with malice. Maybe it's time you left before I make it official. David drew in a slow, deliberate breath, his fingers curling tighter around the mug, the ceramic warm against his skin. He could feel the weight of the officer's presence, the simmering hatred in his words pressing down like a physical force. He glanced at his watch again, the seconds ticking by with agonizing slowness, and wondered how much longer Ryan would be. Maybe I'll wait right here, David said at last, his tone firm, unyielding. The officer's face darkened, his eyes narrowing to slits. Suit yourself, old man. Just know I'll be watching. The tension hung thick in the air, a storm brewing in the space between them. David's hand gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles paling as the officer Stark. His name tag red loomed closer, his face inches from David's own. Stark's eyes were cold, twin shards of ice boring into him, his voice dropping to a venomous hiss. I told you once, old man. I don't want to tell you again. You're not wanted here. People like you think you can just stroll in, sit wherever you please, like you belong. David looked up at him, his expression still calm, but with a spark of defiance flickering in his dark eyes. I'm here waiting for my son. I've got just as much right as anyone else to sit here and have a coffee. Stark's laugh was bitter, a sound that grated against the quiet of the diner. All right? He leaned forward, his face twisting into a mocking grin, his breath brushing David's cheek. Rights are for people who actually earn them, not some washed-up old man with a fake ID. David's voice hardened, cutting through the haze of Stark's disdain. It's not fake. I earned that ID and the title on it as any other veteran. Stark sneered, tilting his head as if sizing David up. Sure you did. Guys like you always got a story, don't you? Always talking about how hard you had it. What you earned. He looked down his nose at David, his lip curling. Well, maybe you haven't earned anything except a one-way ticket out of here. David's chest rose and fell with a slow, steady breath, his voice growing firmer, a quiet strength threading through it. I served this country with respect, and I didn't come here looking for trouble. I came for a quiet cup of coffee. Stark's laughter erupted again, harsh and grating, echoing through the diner like a gunshot. Quiet. Oh, I think you're making quite a bit of noise just sitting here, looking like you don't belong. Without warning, he reached over, his hand rough and careless, and shoved David's mug across the table. The ceramic wobbled precariously, teetering on the edge before tipping over with a dull clatter. Coffee spilled across the table, soaking into David's coat and dripping onto the floor in dark, uneven pools. David drew in a sharp breath, his hands steadying himself as the liquid seeped into the fabric. But Stark leaned closer, his sneer pulling tighter. You're making this place look bad, you know that. A place like this doesn't need your kind dragging it down. The words rang out, loud enough to turn heads. The older man in the corner shifted uncomfortably, his spoon clinking louder against his cup. The woman with the magazine glanced up, her eyes wide with unease before darting back to the pages. The waitress lingered near the counter, her fingers tightening around the newspaper, her lips pressed into a thin line as if debating whether to intervene. David met Stark's gaze, his voice low but resolute, cutting through the chaos. "I'm not going anywhere, officer. I'll leave when my son gets heroin out because you're throwing a fit." Stark's face contorted, his tone darkening as he spat the words, "A fit? You don't get to talk to me like that, old man. I'm the law here. You don't just sit around disrespecting me like you think you're untouchable." "Respect has to be earned," David said, his voice razor-sharp, unwavering despite the storm brewing around him. Stark's fury erupted, his features twisting into a mask of rage. "Earned? You're telling me about earning respect? Coming in here, acting all high and mighty with your so-called veteran status, thinking that makes you better than everyone else?" David's eyes didn't waver. "I think it means I deserve to be here just as much as anyone else," he replied, his calm a stark contrast to Stark's venom. The officer's eyes flashed, a dangerous glint igniting within them. "Oh, you deserve something. All right," he hissed, leaning so close David could feel the heat of his breath. "People like you acting like you're above the rules, like you're something special." "I don't think I'm special," David said, the patience in his voice fraying at the edges. "But I know my rights, and I know that sitting here having a coffee isn't hurting anyone." Stark's lips curled into a sneer, his face a twisted caricature of contempt. Then, in a sudden, shocking move, he leaned forward and spat a thick, wet glob landing squarely on David's cheek. The diner fell silent, the air sucked out of the room as the act hung there, raw and ugly. David froze, the warm spittle sliding down his skin, his heart pounding in his chest. For a moment, he was back in the past decades ago, standing in a muddy trench, staring down fear and death with nothing but his resolve to keep him upright. He wiped his face with a slow, deliberate motion, his eyes locking onto Stark's with a fire that hadn't burned in years. Stark straightened, a triumphant smirk playing on his lips, oblivious to the storm he'd unleashed. "Time to go, old man," he said, reaching for his cuffs. "You're under arrest loitering, resisting, whatever I feel like calling it." David didn't move, didn't flinch, even as the cold metal snapped around his wrists. The waitress gasped softly, her newspaper crumpling in her hands. The older man set his cup down with a trembling hand, his face pale. The woman by the window stared, her magazine forgotten, her breath caught in her throat. Stark yanked David to his feet, shoving him toward the door with a roughness that spoke of unchecked power. But as they stepped outside, the screech of tires cut through the tension. A sleek black car pulled up, and out stepped Ryantel, sharp-eyed, and dressed in the crisp uniform of a federal agent, his badge gleaming in the dim light. Stark froze, his grip loosening on David's arm as recognition dawned. Ryan's voice was ice-cold, authoritative, slicing through the air. "Let him go." Now, the officer's smirk vanished, replaced by a flicker of panic as he realized who David's son was, a man with the power to unravel his world. David stood tall, his dignity unshaken, a quiet testament to the justice that comes when arrogance oversteps its bounds. Stark's abuse of authority had led him here, to a moment where the consequences of his actions would echo far beyond this diner, a lesson in the fragility of power wielded without restraint. The diner was a quiet hum of clinking plates and murmured conversations, until the moment a thick glob of spit landed on David's weathered coat. For a fleeting second, time seemed to halt. Forks paused midair, breaths caught in throats, and the air grew heavy with disbelief. The onlookers, a scattering of regulars nursing their coffees, froze in their seats, eyes wide with shock. Even the waitress, a young woman with tired eyes and a tray balanced on her hip, stumbled back a step, her hand flying to her mouth as if to stifle a gasp. The room held its breath, waiting for what would come next. David's jaw tightened, the muscles in his face pulling taut like a bowstring ready to snap. His hands, rough and calloused from years of labor, gripped the edge of the table, knuckles whitening under the strain. Yet he didn't flinch, didn't shift an inch. His steely gaze locked onto Stark, the officer looming over him, unyielding as a storm cloud. Inside, David felt a flicker of something raw-wonger. Yes, but also a deep, aching weariness. He'd seen men like this before, puffed up with power they didn't earn, and it stirred a bitter memory he'd long buried. Stark, towering in his crisp uniform, let a slow, mocking smile curl across his lips. "Disgusting, isn't it?" he taunted, his voice dripping with venom. He leaned in closer, savoring the moment, his eyes glinting with cruel delight. That's what you are, old man, something to be spat on, something that doesn't belong here. His words were a blade, sharp and deliberate, meant to cut deep. He stood there, chest puffed out, the badge on his uniform gleaming under the diner's fluorescent lights a symbol. He wielded like a crown. David drew a long, steadying breath, the kind that anchored him through decades of storms far worse than this. His chest rose and fell, and though his heart pounded, he kept it caged behind a wall of calm. "Is that what you think?" he asked, his voice low but steady, each syllable carrying the weight of a man who'd faced down hell and walked away standing. "That you're better than me because of that shiny badge pinned to your chest?" His eyes never wavered, boring into Stark with an intensity that made the younger man shift uncomfortably. Though he'd never admit it, Stark's grin stretched wider, a predator baring its teeth. "It's not just the badge, old man," he sneered, crossing his arms as if to emphasize his authority. "It's what I stand for: order, control, things you people can't seem to wrap your heads around. And I'm telling you right now, get up and walk out that door, or I'll haul you out myself." His tone was a command, laced with the arrogance of someone who'd never been told no and didn't expect to start now. David's voice dropped to a whisper, but it cut through the tension like a knife. "I've faced worse than you, officer," he said, his words deliberate, etched with the quiet strength of a man who'd seen battlefields and survived. "And I'm not moving." Inside, he felt the ghosts of his past stirring memories of barked orders, of boots on blood-soaked ground, of men who thought power came from a gun or a title. Stark was just another echo of that, a shadow pretending to be a giant. The officer's expression darkened, his smugness giving way to a flicker of irritation. He stepped forward, planting a heavy hand on David's shoulder, fingers digging into the worn fabric of his coat. The grip was hard, meant to intimidate, but David didn't budge. His body tensed, but his face remained a mask of defiance. "You're making a mistake," Stark hissed, his breath hot and sharp, his patience fraying at the edges. "You want to talk about respect? Respect means listening to authority. It means knowing when to back down. Authority doesn't give you the right to abuse people," David replied, his voice growing firmer, each word a hammer striking steel. He straightened in his chair, shoulders squaring as if shedding an invisible weight. "And if you think pushing me around proves you're strong, then you don't understand respect at all." His tone was a quiet thunder, rolling with the wisdom of someone who'd learned justice wasn't a gift, it was a fight. Stark's face twisted with rage, a storm brewing behind his eyes. Without warning, he shoved the table hard, sending it skidding across the linoleum with a jarring crash. Plates clattered to the floor, coffee sloshed in dark pools, and David's chair rocked violently. He caught himself just before he fell, one hand gripping the seat, his breath sharp but controlled. The officer's face was flushed now, a deep crimson spreading from his neck to his ears, his chest heaving with ragged breaths. He reached down, seizing David's shoulder in a bruising grip, and yanked him to his feet. "I told you to leave," Stark bellowed, his voice bouncing off the diner's walls, silencing the murmurs of the stunned crowd. "You don't belong here, and I don't want to see your face again at it." David steadied himself, planting his feet firmly on the ground. His voice, though calm, carried a thread of iron that hadn't been there before. "I don't answer to people like you," he said, meeting Stark's glare head-on. "I answer to my own principles, and I'm not backing down." His heart thudded in his chest, but it wasn't fear driving it was conviction, a fire kindled by years of standing up when others would have knelt. Stark's eyes flashed with fury, and he shoved David backward with enough force to make him stumble. "All right, tough guy," he snarled, his lips curling into a sneer. "Let's see how brave you are in a cell." He grabbed David's arms, wrenching them behind his back with a roughness that made the old man's shoulders ache. The cold bite of handcuffs snapped around his wrists, the metal digging into his skin. The onlookers watched in stunned silence, their faces a mix of fear and disbelief. Some shifted uncomfortably, others stared with wide, unblinking eyes. The waitress clutched her tray tighter, her knuckles white, her breath shallow as she wrestled with the urge to intervene but didn't dare. "You think you're above the law," Stark spat, his voice thick with contempt as he shoved David toward the door. The officer's smug grin widened, a triumphant gleam in his eyes as he marched his prisoner forward. David's wrists strained against the cuffs, the pressure sending a dull throb up his arms. But it was the smirk on Stark's face that pushed him closer to a breaking point. He could feel the cracks forming in his calm exterior, the anger bubbling up like lava beneath a thinning crust. "You think this makes you tough, don't you?" David said, his voice low but trembling with a fury he rarely let loose. "Shoving an old man around, throwing your weight like this makes you a big man?" Stark barely glanced back, his sneer sharp as a blade. "Keep talking, old man. It won't change where you're going." He strode ahead, his boots thudding against the floor, confident in his control. But David's next words came out in a harsh, bitter laugh that stopped Stark cold. "Where I'm going?" he said, the sound raw and jagged. "Boy, I've been places you couldn't survive for a minute. I've stared down men twice your size, and I didn't take half the disrespect you're dishing out now." Stark whirled around, his face darkening like a thunderhead. "Disrespect," he snapped, stepping closer, his breath hot and uneven. "You think you deserve respect?" He let out a cold, hollow laugh, the sound echoing in the tense air. "You think sitting there, acting like you're better than everyone, makes you worth a damn?" His fingers tightened on David's arm, nails digging in as if to anchor his crumbling composure. David's eyes narrowed, his voice rising with a heat that surprised even him. "Better than everyone?" he repeated, each word a challenge. "You want to talk about acting? Look at you, puffed up in that uniform, trying to prove something that isn't there. You're nothing but a bully with a badge." His chest heaved, the weight of the cuffs forgotten as he leaned into his words, his gaze burning with a fire that refused to be doused. Stark's face twisted, his grip on David's arm tightening until it hurt. "Watch it, old man," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. "You're already in deep enough." His eyes darted around, catching the nervous stares of the diner's patrons, the elderly couple in the corner, clutching their mugs, the trucker at the counter who'd stopped mid-bite, the waitress whose hands trembled as she hovered near the kitchen door. Their attention fueled his anger, but it also pricked at something deeper doubt, maybe, or the faintest hint of shame. "No, you watch it," David shot back, yanking his arm free despite the cuffs, the sudden movement making Stark stumble. "You think you're something special because you can push people around? You think that uniform makes you invincible, that I'm supposed to cower because you've got a badge?" His voice was a whip, cracking through the air, and Stark's face flushed an even deeper red, his breathing quickening as the words hit their mark. "Shut up," Stark growled, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper, his control slipping. "You're going to shut your mouth right now, or I swear." "Or you'll what?" David cut in, his tone fierce and unyielding. "You're already manhandling me, throwing me around like trash. What's next? You going to beat an old man in public because you can't handle a little truth?" His eyes blazed, daring Stark to cross that line, to show the world what he really was. Stark's face darkened, and in a flash, he spat again, the glob landing on David's coat with a wet, sickening splat. "There's your truth," he hissed, smirking as he watched it slide down the fabric, a grotesque badge of his own making. He stood there, chest heaving, waiting for David to break. David looked down at the spit, his jaw clenching so hard it ached. Something inside him snapped not with fear, but with a rage that had been simmering for too long. "You think that makes you powerful," he said, his voice seething, each word a molten ember. "You're a coward. You think spitting on a man makes you strong. You're nothing but a disgrace to that uniform." For a split second, Stark's expression faltered, his fists tightening as he fought to hold his ground. "You don't know a damn thing about me, old man," he snarled, stepping closer, his voice trembling with barely contained fury. "You're a nobody, a washed-up relic wasting space and making everyone else uncomfortable." "Oh, I know enough," David fired back, his eyes blazing with a clarity that cut through Stark's bravado. "I know you're a scared little man hiding behind that badge because you'd be nothing without it. You're the kind who needs a uniform just to feel important, aren't you?" His words were a mirror, reflecting Stark's insecurities back at him, and the officer's face went crimson, his composure unraveling. "Keep talking," Stark hissed, his voice barely audible. And I'll make sure you spend the night in a cell. I'll throw away the key if I have to." He grabbed David's shoulder again, shoving him toward the squad car parked just outside the diner's glass doors. The neon sign buzzed overhead, casting a sickly glow on the scene unfolding below. "Do it," David said, his tone daring, laced with contempt. "Throw me in a cell if that's all you know how to do. But remember, you're the one showing your true colors. You're the one acting like a scared, small-minded bully." His voice rose, carrying across the parking lot, and a few passers-by stopped, their heads turning toward the commotion. Stark's lip curled, and he yanked David forward with a roughness that made the old man's knees buckle for a moment. "You're done," he snapped. "I'm putting an end to this right now." He shoved David toward the car, his hands trembling with a mix of rage and something unspoken fear, perhaps. That David's words had struck too close to home. David pulled back, his eyes alight with a fire that surprised even him. "You don't get to put an end to anything," he said, his voice rising with each word, resonating with a strength that refused to be silenced. "You think you're better than me? You think your badge makes you worth something? I served this countryman like me, fought and bled so you could parade around, pretending to be someone you're not." Stark yanked open the car door, practically throwing David inside. "Get in the car and shut up," he barked, his voice cracking under the strain. David leaned forward, undeterred, his words sharp even as Stark tried to slam the door. "I may be in cuffs, but don't think for a second I'm the one cowering. You're scared, officer scared of being nothing without that uniform, scared because deep down, you know I'm right." The door slammed shut with a force that rattled the frame, and Stark stormed to the driver's side, his breaths coming in short, angry bursts. His hands shook as he gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white against the black leather. David didn't look away, his gaze piercing through the rearview mirror, locking onto Stark's eyes. "You're afraid," he said, his voice cutting through the suffocating silence, steady and unrelenting. "Afraid that one day, people will see you for what you really are." Stark's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. The engine roared to life, and the car lurched forward, tires crunching against the gravel. Inside, David sat tall despite the cuffs, his mind racing with the weight of what had just happened. He'd seen justice twisted before, watched power corrupt men who didn't deserve it. But this was a lesson carved in flesh and bone. Stark thought he'd won, thought his badge gave him the final word, but David knew better. True strength didn't come from a uniform or a cell, it came from standing firm, even when the world tried to break you. And as the diner faded into the distance, he knew this wasn't the end. It was a reckoning, a reminder that abusing power carried a cost, one Stark would face in time. The night air hung heavy with tension as Stark's patrol car rumbled away from the diner's gravel-strewn parking lot, its tires crunching against the loose stones in a rhythm that matched the pounding in David's chest. In the back seat, David sat with his spine rigid, his wrists chafed and stinging from the handcuffs that bit into his skin. His pulse thundered in his ears, a wild mix of fury and triumph coursing through him. He had just unleashed a torrent of truth, on Stark words sharp enough to pierce the officer's fragile ego. Though he knew he'd crossed a dangerous line, regret was the furthest thing from his mind. Stark's face, twisted into a mask of barely contained rage, glared back at him through the rearview mirror, but the man said nothing. His jaw was locked tight, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the steering wheel, the engine's low growl filling the silence between them. David's breath came in steady, measured bursts as he replayed the confrontation in his mind. He'd been sitting quietly at the diner, nursing a lukewarm coffee and waiting for his son, when Stark had stormed in, badge gleaming like a weapon. The officer had taken one look at David, an older black man in a worn jacket, and decided he didn't belong. What followed was a barrage of accusations, a shove, and the cold snap of cuffs around his wrists. But David hadn't bowed. He'd met Stark's venom with fire of his own, calling him out for the small, pitiful man he was, a coward cloaked in authority. The memory of Stark's flinch, the flicker of doubt in his eyes, fueled David's resolve. He wouldn't let this man strip him of his voice or his dignity. The drive to the station stretched on, the world outside blurring into streaks of shadow and sodium-lit streets. Neither man spoke. the air thick with unspoken loathing. David's gaze drifted to the window, catching fleeting glimpses of the town he'd called home for Decadessa Place, where he'd raised a family, paid his taxes, and earned his place. Yet here he was, shackled like a criminal for daring to exist in a space Stark deemed unfit for him. The injustice of it burned deep in his gut, but beneath the anger lay a quiet certainty. His words had landed a blow. Stark could pretend all he wanted, but David had seen the crack in his armor. When they reached the station, Stark yanked the car door open with a force that sent it banging against its hinges out. He barked, his voice rough with irritation. David stepped onto the pavement, his legs stiff from the cramped ride, and Stark seized his arm, shoving him toward the building. The officer's grip was harsh, his fingers digging into David's flesh as if to remind him who held the power, or so he thought. Inside, the station was a stark contrast to the diner's warmth. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly glow over peeling paint and scuffed linoleum. Stark marched him down a narrow hallway, past a desk where a young officer glanced up briefly before looking away, unwilling to meet David's steady gaze. They stopped at a cell, a cold, barren box of concrete and steel. Stark pushed David inside with a grunt, the motion so abrupt it nearly sent him stumbling. The cell door swung shut behind him, the metal crashing into place with a deafening clang that reverberated through the empty space. For a moment, the sound swallowed everything, a hollow echo that seemed to mock David's predicament. Stark lingered outside the bars, crossing his arms and fixing David with a smug, crooked smile. "But you're feeling real proud of yourself now, huh?" he taunted, his voice dripping with disdain. "All that big talk, and look where it got you right where you belong." David stood motionless, his sore wrists throbbing as he drew a slow, deliberate breath. The air in the cell was stale, tinged with the faint scent of disinfectant and despair, but he refused to let it seep into him. Raising his eyes to meet Stark's, he spoke, his voice low and steady, simmering with a controlled fury. "You think this makes you strong?" he asked, each word deliberate, cutting through the tension like a blade. "You think locking me up in this cage proves you're a big man?" Stark's sneer stretched wider, but there was a flicker of unease in his posture, a subtle shift that betrayed his bravado. "It reminds you who's in charge," he shot back. "You're nothing. Old man, just another loudmouth who thought he could strut around wherever he pleased." David's eyes narrowed, his gaze piercing through Stark's facade. "I was sitting in a diner," he said, his tone hardening, "waiting for my son. I didn't raise my voice or lift a finger. You're the one who made a scene, strutting in there like some wannabe king because you've got a badge to hide behind." He shook his head, a bitter smile tugging at his lips as he watched Stark's expression falter. "That's what's pathetic, using your little power trip to feel like somebody." Stark's face darkened, his hands clenching into fists as he stepped closer to the bars. "Pathetic," he spat, his voice rising with indignation. "You're the one sitting in a cell, and you've got the guts to call me pathetic. You should be thanking me I didn't drag you out of there by your neck." David's stare didn't waver, his voice sharpening as he leaned forward slightly. "Oh, I've seen worse than you," he said, memories flashing behind his eyes-grueling dawns in foreign lands. The weight of a rifle in his hands, the screams of men who never came home. "I've seen men who thought power was a tool to crush people, to make them feel small. Every one of them was a coward, just like you." Stark's face flushed crimson, his hands gripping the bars so tightly his knuckles gleamed white under the harsh light. He was trembling now, struggling to hold his composure as David's words sank in. "You don't know a damn thing about me," he hissed, his voice cracking with rage. "You think your time in the service makes you better than me? Think it gives you some kind of free pass?" A hollow laugh escaped David's throat, raw and unyielding. "A free pass, that's rich. Coming from a man who only gets respect because of that shiny badge. Take it away, and what are you? Nothing." Stark's breath hitched, his grip tightening until the metal creaked under his hands. "Listen to yourself," he snarled, leaning in close enough for David to smell the coffee on his breath. "You're just a washed-up old man who can't handle that his day's over. You don't belong here, never did." David's eyes locked onto Stark's, unwavering and fierce. "I belong wherever I damn well please," he said, his voice steady as stone. "You turned this into something about me, about what you think I am. That's your failure. Star, not mine." For a moment, Stark's face contorted with fury so intense it seemed he might lunge through the bars. Then, abruptly, he stepped back, his voice dropping to a low, venomous mutter. "You're done," he said, turning sharply on his heel. His boots thudded against the floor as he stormed off, the sound fading into the silence until David was left alone. The cell closed in around him, the unyielding concrete walls, the frigid metal bench, the relentless glare of the lights overhead. It was a space designed to strip a man bare, to drown him in his own powerlessness. But David refused to break. He lowered himself onto the bench, his movements deliberate, his shoulders squared despite the ache in his bones. He drew a deep breath, forcing the anger to settle, channeling it into something unbreakable. In the stillness, memories crept in unbidden. He could feel the heft of a service rifle in his palms, the bite of frost on his skin during pre-dawn patrols, the camaraderie of soldiers who'd become brothersome, lost forever to the earth they'd fought on. He'd served for something greater than himself, for freedom, for the right to sit in a diner without being judged by the likes of Stark. The anger in his chest flared again, but now it was tempered by a fierce determination. He wouldn't let this petty tyrant diminish him. He'd raised a son, Ryan, who understood justice, who'd inherited his father's unyielding sense of right and wrong. Ryan would come, and when he did, Stark would face the reckoning he'd brought upon himself. Time dragged on, the cold seeping into David's joints as he sat in that unforgiving cell. Hours felt like days, the silence broken only by the distant hum of the station. Yet his patience held firm, a quiet anticipation building within him. He knew Ryan wouldn't let this stand. And then, like a storm breaking, the sound of commotion erupted down the hell-raised voices. The shuffle of boots, a commanding tone cutting through the chaos. David straightened, his heart leaping as he recognized his son's voice, resonant and furious. "What the hell is going on here?" Ryan demanded, his words echoing with an authority that made the walls themselves seem to tremble. Beyond the cell, Stark had been slouched at the front desk, smirking to himself as he recounted his triumph to a junior officer, a weary kid named Jenkins, who nodded along nervously, his eyes darting toward the hallway. At Ryan's rival, Stark's smugness vanished, his face draining of color as he scrambled to his feet. He'd never expected Captain Ryan Carter, decorated officer, respected Lee Durdo, storm through those doors, swallowing hard. Stark smoothed his uniform and stepped forward, his voice faltering. "Captain Carter, you didn't expect you here," he stammered, forcing a veneer of calm. Ryan's gaze was ice, his jaw set as he towered over Stark. "Didn't expect me?" he repeated, his tone laced with scorn. "Did you think I wouldn't hear about you dragging my father out of a diner and throwing him in a cell? Did you think no one would talk?" Stark's flush deepened, his mouth opening and closing as he groped for an excuse. "Sir, so didn't know he was your father," he managed, his voice thin. "I thought he was just well. I thought he was causing trouble." Ryan stepped closer, his eyes blazing with a fury that made Jenkins shrink back behind the desk. "You thought he was some random black man you could push around," Ryan said, his voice low and lethal. "You didn't even see him as a person, just someone you could flex your power over. And you figured no one would care." Stark's bravado crumbled, his hands fidgeting at his sides. "Captain, with all due respect," he was belligerent, disrespectful. He protested weakly. "I was keeping the peace. People at the diner were uncomfortable." Ryan's laugh was sharp, cutting through the room like a whip. "Uncomfortable. The only one stirring up trouble was you, Stark. I talked to every witness there." Eddie said my father was sitting quietly until you barged in and made it your personal crusade. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "This isn't about peace. It's about you abusing the power you were given. And that's a lesson in justice you're about to learn the hard way." David, listening from his cell, felt a swell of pride. The consequences of Stark's arrogance were closing in, and in that moment, he knew the truth would prevail not through force, but through the unwavering strength of those who stood against tyranny. The day had started like any other for David, a man weathered by time, yet unbowed by its weight. He sat alone in the corner booth of the small-town diner, his hands resting calmly on the table, fingers tracing the rim of a chipped coffee mug. The hum of quiet conversation filled the air. punctuated by the clatter of plates and the faint sizzle of grease from the kitchen. He liked it her the simplicity of it, the way the world seemed to slow down for a moment. No one bothered him, and he bothered no one. That was until Officer Stark stormed in, his boots thudding heavily against the worn linoleum floor, his presence radiating a restless, coiled energy that seemed to suck the peace right out of the room. David barely had time to register the intrusion before Stark was upon him, his voice sharp and accusing, cutting through the diner's calm like a blade. "You don't belong here," Stark barked, his eyes narrowed with contempt, as though David's very existence offended him. The older man's brow furrowed slightly, confusion flickering in his steady gaze. He opened his mouth to respond, to ask what he'd done to provoke such hostility. But Stark didn't wait for an answer. Instead, the officer lunged forward, his hands rough and unyielding as he seized David by the collar of his faded jacket. A gasp rippled through the diner as forks paused midair and heads turned. But no one dared intervene. The humiliation came swiftly, a brutal cascade of actions that left David reeling. Stark's spit landed hot and wet on his cheek, a deliberate mark of disrespect that stung worse than any blow. Then came the shove, a hard, forceful push that sent David stumbling backward, his hip crashing painfully against the edge of a table. Before he could regain his footing, Stark had him by the arm, dragging him toward the door with a grip that bruised. The diner blurred around him, a haze of shocked faces and muted whispers, as he was hauled outside and thrown into the back of a patrol car. The cell door clanged shut behind him minutes later at the station, the sound echoing in his ears like a judgment. Alone in the dim, concrete box, David sat on the edge of the cot, his hands trembling slightly not from fear, but from a quiet, burning indignation. He'd faced worse in his life, far worse, but this was a betrayal of everything he'd ever believed about fairness, about decency. Meanwhile, miles away, Captain Ryan was finishing a routine shift, his mind already drifting to the quiet evening he'd planned with his father. A call crackled over the radio, urgent and disjointed, pulling him back to the present. "Captain, you'd better get down here," a nervous voice said, belonging to one of the younger officers. "It's your dad." Starks locked him up. Ryan's heart lurched, a cold dread pooling in his stomach. His fingers tightened around the steering wheel as he sped toward the station, the world outside the car blurring into streaks of color. His father, his steady, principled father in a cell. The thought was unthinkable. A violation so deep it set his blood simmering with a rage he rarely allowed himself to feel. When Ryan burst through the station doors, the air was thick with tension. Officers milled about, their movements hesitant, their eyes darting anywhere but at him. He found Stark leaning against a desk, arms crossed, a smug tilt to his mouth that made Ryan's fists itch to wipe it away. The officer straightened slightly as Ryan approached, but the defiance in his posture remained. A silent challenge. "Captain," Stark began, his tone clipped, "I didn't know he was your father. Not that it matters," was acting like he didn't belong. "Refused to leave when I told him to." The words hit Ryan like a slap, each syllable stoking the fire in his chest. His knuckles whitened as his hands balled into fists, the skin stretching tight over bone. "Didn't belong," Ryan repeated, his voice low and dangerous, the calm before a storm. He took a step closer, his broad frame towering over Stark, who shifted uncomfortably under the weight of his gaze. "You think that badge pinned to your chest gives you the right to decide who belongs where? You think it lets you treat people like they're nothing?" His father's face flashed in his mind's proud, weathered features, the dignity etched into every line. The idea of Stark spitting on him, shoving him, locking him away like some stray dodger twisted something deep inside Ryan, a fury laced with a piercing ache. He has every right to sit wherever he damn well pleases. And you humiliated him because you wanted to feel big. Stark's composure faltered, his bravado cracking like thin ice. His voice trembled slightly as he tried to defend himself, clutching at the frayed edges of protocol like a lifeline. "Sir, I was following procedure." He was uncooperative, disruptive. "I was protecting the community." But the excuse sounded hollow, even to his own ears. And Ryan's eyes blazed with a fury that silenced any further protest. "Uncooperative," he snapped, his voice rising, each word a hammer strike. You spat on him. You threw him into a cell like he was trashel, because he didn't kiss your boots fast enough to suit your ego. The room seemed to shrink around them, the air heavy with the weight of Ryan's anger. Nearby officers froze, their faces a mixture of unease and shame, avoiding Stark's pleading glances as if he were contagious. Stark's face flushed a deep crimson, embarrassment warring with frustration as he struggled to hold his ground. With all due respect, Captain, he acted like he was above authority, he muttered, his voice shrinking under Ryan's unrelenting stare. Ryan took another step forward, close enough now to see the sweat beading on Stark's forehead, the faint twitch of his jaw. Above authority, he echoed, his tone dropping to a deadly calm that sent a shiver through the room. My father didn't act like he was above anything. He acted like a man who knows his worth, and you couldn't stand it. You couldn't handle that he wouldn't cower, that he wouldn't let you break him. The officer's defiance crumbled fully then, his shoulders slumping as he looked down at the floor. His voice barely a whisper. I didn't mean for it to go that far. But Ryan wasn't done. His voice softened, but the anger still simmered beneath it, a molten undercurrent that refused to cool. You don't get to mean anything anymore, Stark. You crossed a line just with him, but with everyone who's ever trusted you to wear that badge with honor. You've shown us all what you really are, a coward hiding behind power, too small to wield it justly. Silence fell, thick and suffocating, as Ryan's words lingered in the air. Stark's mouth opened, a desperate plea forming. Captain, I'm a good officer. I've been here for years. This was just one mistake, but Ryan cut him off, his voice fierce and unyielding. A mistake. Forgetting to log a call is a mistake. What you did was a choice. You let your arrogance and your prejudice steer you, and you degraded a man who's earned more respect in a single day than you will in a lifetime. You treated him like he was less than human, because you couldn't see past your own petty need to control. Stark swallowed hard, his face a mask of anger and humiliation, but he nodded stiffly, the fight draining out of him. Ryan's gaze hardened further, his resolve steel. You're going to face the consequences. A formal review starts tomorrow, and if there's any justice left in this department, you'll be gone by week's end. We don't need officers who trample people underfoot to feel tall. He stepped back, his voice dropping to a chilling whisper. And if you think this ends here, think again. You'll answer for every single thing you've done to disgrace that badge. With that, Ryan turned, his boots echoing against the tile as he strode toward the cell where his father waited. The lock clicked open with a sharp, metallic snap, and David rose slowly, his movements deliberate, his eyes meeting Ryan's with a quiet strength that spoke volumes. Pride flickered in those depths, gratitude too, and something deeper, a shared understanding of what it meant to stand against wrong, no matter the cost. Without a word, Ryan guided his father out, the weight of the day pressing heavily on his shoulders as they stepped into the cool evening air. Outside, in a shadowed corner away from the station's harsh lights, Ryan stopped, turning to face David. His chest tightened, a storm of emotions swirling within rage at Stark. Regret that he hadn't been there sooner, and a fierce, unspoken admiration for the man before him. Dad, he began, his voice catching, uncharacteristically unsteady. I'm sorry. I'm so damn sorry I didn't get there faster, that you had to sit in that cell at all. David's hand found his shoulder, a firm, grounding squeeze that steadied him. Ryan, he said, his voice calm, unwavering, you did right by me. You didn't let him walk away from this. You can't be everywhere, son. But you can make it right when it matters, and you did. Ryan's jaw clenched, his gaze drifting to the horizon, where the last streaks of daylight bled into dusk. I can't believe he did that to you, he muttered, the anger flaring again, sharp and hot. I knew Stark had a temper, but this was something else. He spat on you, Dad. David's expression darkened, a rare shadow crossing his features, but his voice remained steady. Men like him see power as a club to swing, not a duty to carry. That badge was just an excuse, a shield for his bitterness. You can dress a man in honor, but it doesn't make him honorable. The words settled between them, heavy with truth. Ryan's fists tightened again, his shoulders rigid with the effort to contain his fury. The way he treated Yowie, can't let it go. Dad, he had no right, not to you, not to anyone. especially not someone who's given everything for this country. The way he spoke to you, it made me want to tear that badge off his chest myself." David's eyes softened, a faint smile tugging at his lips as he nodded. "And you've spent your life proving that it doesn't have to be that way, Ryan. You've shown respect, integrity. Today, you showed that you won't let injustice slide, not even from your own. That's a strength Stark will never grasp." Ryan drew a deep breath, his voice thick with emotion. "I never wanted you to face this. Not from one of my officers. When I took this job, I swore I'd be different, that I'd protect people like you from ever feeling this kind of disrespect again." David's gaze held his, pride shining through. "You've done more than enough, son, today. You showed everyone in that station that respect isn't demanded, it's earned. I know you wanted to shield me, but don't carry this guilt." You stood up, and that's all I could ever ask. For a moment, they stood in silence, the day's weight settling into a shared resolve. Then Ryan straightened, a spark of determination in his eyes. "Tomorrow, we start the review. I'm going to make sure Stark answers for this, Dad. He doesn't get to walk away." David gave a small, approving nod. "Then go do what's right, son. I trust you." Their eyes met, a quiet, resolute bond forged ununit just by blood, but by a mutual stand for justice. A lesson in the cost of power misused and the courage it takes to set it right. The conference room buzzed with a tense energy, its air thick with the weight of authority and expectation. A sea of faces filled the space's senior officers in crisp uniforms, their badges glinting under the harsh fluorescent lights, sat shoulder to shoulder with representatives from internal affairs, their expressions a mix of stern resolve and quiet scrutiny. At one end of the long, polished table, Officer Ryan Stark perched uneasily on the edge of his chair, his broad shoulders, usually squared with confidence, now hunched slightly as he shifted his weight, the creak of the seat cutting through the murmurs. His face, drained of its usual ruddy hue, gleamed pale and clammy, and his eyes darted restlessly, avoiding the piercing stares that bore into him from every direction. Across the table sat Captain Ryan, his posture rigid, his jaw set like stone. His dark eyes burned with a quiet, unyielding intensity, offering no hint of mercy or reprieve. The internal affairs representative, a woman with sharp features and a voice that sliced through the room's low hum, rose to her feet. She cleared her throat with deliberate force, commanding the attention of every soul present. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her tone crisp and authoritative. "We've gathered here today to dissect the actions of Officer Ryan Stark. This review centers on the incident at the diner involving Mr. David Carter, a matter that demands we determine whether Stark's conduct aligned with the policies of this department and, more critically, whether he remains fit to carry the badge he wears." Her words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding, as the room fell into a suffocating silence. Stark's head swiveled, his gaze flickering across the faces around him. The defiance that once defined him, the cocky tilt of his chin, the smirk that dared anyone to challenge him had evaporated, leaving behind a man teetering on the edge of panic. His fingers twitched against the table's edge as he met Ryan's unflinching stare. For a moment, he tried to summon his old bravado, straightening in his seat and forcing his trembling lips to part. "With all due respect," he said, his voice quivering despite his efforts to steady it, "I don't think this whole review is even necessary. I was just doing my job. I followed the rules procedure, you know." The words stumbled out, fragile and unconvincing, as if he half expected them to collapse under their own weight. Ryan leaned forward, his elbows pressing into the table, his voice a low, steady rumble that carried the weight of barely restrained fury. "Your job, following procedure," he repeated, each syllable dripping with disbelief. "Are you seriously sitting there telling us that spitting on a defenseless old man, shoving him around like some street thug, and throwing him in a cell, that's your definition of procedure?" His eyes narrowed, pinning Stark in place like a predator sizing up its prey. The room seemed to shrink under the force of his words, the air growing colder, sharper. Stark's face flushed a deep, mottled red, the color creeping up his neck as he scrambled to defend himself. "Sir," he was uncooperative. He stammered, his hands gesturing wildly as if to conjure some justification from thin air. Disrespectful, even. He wouldn't leave when I told him to. Thought I had to get him out of there. For the safety of everyone else in the diner. You understand?" His voice cracked, betraying the desperation clawing at his chest, but he pressed on, clinging to his flimsy excuse like a drowning man to a splintered plank. Ryan's tone dropped even lower, icy and cutting. "For the safety of everyone else," he echoed, his words laced with scorn. "You expect us to swallow that? A 70-year-old man, sitting there minding his own business, sipping his coffee in a quiet corner. You're telling me he was a threat? Or maybe," he paused, letting the silence stretch taut, "maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe you just didn't like the look of him. Maybe you decided he didn't belong in your diner, and that gave you the right to treat him like trash." Stark's eyes darted around the table, frantic now, searching for a lifeline nod, a softened glance, anything to break the wall of disapproval closing in around him. But all he found were cold, unyielding stares, the faces of his peers carved from granite. He sucked in a shaky breath, his chest heaving as he tried to steady his unraveling composure. "Tu was just doing what I thought was right in the moment, Captain," he managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know he was your father. I swear I didn't." Ryan's hand slammed down on the table, the sharp crack reverberating through the room like a gunshot. "That's the whole damn point, Stark," he snapped, his voice rising for the first time. Ron jagged with emotion. "This isn't about him being my father. This is about you abusing the power we gave you. You thought you could humiliate him, grind him into the dirt, because he didn't match your narrow little picture of who deserves respect. You didn't see a man sitting there. You saw a problem, a nuisance, something you could bully and toss aside without a second thought." His words landed like blows, each one stripping away another layer of Stark's crumbling facade. Stark's face twisted, his cheeks burning as shame and defiance warred within him. He looked away, his hands clenching into tight fists in his lap, knuckles whitening under the strain. "Captain, I didn't mean to." He just thought. His voice faltered, the excuse dying in his throat as Ryan cut him off again. "You thought you could treat him like garbage because no one would care enough to stop you," Ryan said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, every word trembling with suppressed rage. "You thought you could flex that badge and walk away clean. And now here you are, squirming, trying to spin this like it was all just part of the job. But there's no talking your way out of this, Stark. No excuse covers what you did." The internal affairs representative leaned forward, her sharp gaze locking onto Stark like a hawk zeroing in on its target. "Officer Stark," she said, her voice calm but edged with steel, "we've heard from multiple witnesses. They say you insulted Mr. Carter, called him names, spat on him, shoved him around with no provocation whatsoever. These are not minor missteps, they're grave accusations. Your conduct is under a microscope here, and the evidence isn't kind. Do you have anything at all to say in your defense?" Stark swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing as he glanced between her and Ryan. Desperation etched deep lines into his face, his eyes wide and pleading. "I've been a good officer," he said, his voice breaking as he leaned forward, grasping at straws. "Years on the force, giving it everything I've got. One bad Kaloni moment's hold erase all that. It shouldn't end me." Ryan shook his head, his expression unyielding, a wall of resolve that Stark couldn't breach. "This wasn't a bad call, Stark," he said, his voice steady and cold. "This was a choice, a deliberate choice to use your authority to degrade, to punish, to hurt a man who'd done nothing to deserve it. And now you're sitting there, begging for a pass, hoping your words can smooth it over. But they can't. You crossed a line, and there's no coming back from it." Stark's defiance shattered at last, his shoulders slumped, his head bowing as if the weight of Ryan's judgment had physically crushed him. "I didn't mean for it to go that far," he muttered, the words barely audible, a last, feeble gasp of self-preservation. Ryan's gaze hardened, his eyes glinting like polished steel. "Maybe you didn't mean it," he said, his voice low and final, "but that doesn't undo what you did. You betrayed the trust this community put in you. You showed every single person in this room that you're not worthy of that badge. Intentions don't erase actions, Stark." A heavy silence descended, Ryan's words settling over the room like a storm cloud breaking open. The officers around the table exchanged slow, solemn nods, their faces reflecting the gravity of the moment. The internal affairs representative straightened, her expression as unreadable as a judge delivering a verdict. "Officer Stark," she said, her voice cutting through the stillness, "based on the evidence, the witness testimonies, and the clear breach of conduct, this review board recommends your immediate termination, effective today. You are no longer a member of this department." Stark's face crumpled, the reality crashing into him like a tidal wave. His mouth opened, then closed, as if he wanted to protest, to claw back some shred of dignity. But the words wouldn't come. He rose slowly, his chair scraping against the floor with a sound that echoed in the oppressive quiet. His eyes swept the room one last time, searching for a flicker of sympathy, a hint of understanding. But he found only cold indifference and quiet condemnation. With a final, bitter glance at Ryan, he turned and shuffled out, his footsteps ringing hollow in the stillness. A defeated man walking away from the life he'd known. Ryan's gaze lingered on the empty doorway for a moment before he turned to the officers, still seated around the table. His voice, though softer now, carried the same unshakable conviction. "Let this be a lesson to every one of you," he said, his eyes sweeping the room. "This badge doesn't make us gods. It doesn't give us the power to pick and choose who gets respect, who gets dignity. It's a promacia to protect and serve everyone, no exceptions. If anyone here thinks they're above that, if anyone thinks they can twist that responsibility into a weapon, then you're welcome to follow Stark out that door. This department won't carry you." No one spoke. The room held its breath, the silence thick with respect and a shared understanding of the line that had been drawn. Ryan stood, his broad frame casting a shadow across the table, and as he moved toward the exit, a quiet satisfaction settled over him. It was bittersweet, tinged with the ache of what his father had endured, but it was just as hard-won and undeniable. He knew, as he stepped into the hallway, that the old man would be proud of the stand he'd taken. Later that evening, the sky bruised with the deep purples and blues of dusk, Ryan guided his car down the familiar winding road to his father's house. The weight of the day clung to him, a heavy mantle he couldn't quite shake. As he pulled into the gravel driveway, the crunch of tires against stone broke the stillness, and he spotted David Carter on the front porch. The old man sat in his weathered rocking chair, the soft glow of the porch light casting a halo round his silver hair. His face, lined with the years and etched with a quiet strength, turned toward Ryan as he approached. There was no urgency in his posture, just a calm patience. But Ryan could feel the undercurrent of anticipation in the way his father's hands rested lightly on the chair's arms. Ryan climbed the steps, the wood creaking under his boots, and settled onto the bench beside David. The night air was cool, carrying the faint chirping of crickets from the fields beyond. For a moment, neither spoke, the silence stretching comfortably between them. Then David's voice, low and rough with age but sharp with curiosity, broke through. "So," he said, his eyes fixed on the horizon, "what did they decide about that officer of yours?" Ryan sighed, running a hand over his face, feeling the stubble rasp against his palm. "They fired him, Dad," he said, his voice steady but heavy with the day's toll. "Terminated, effective immediately. Internal Affairs didn't hesitate, backed it up with everything they had. Stark's done. He won't wear that badge again." David nodded slowly, a flicker of grim satisfaction lighting his weathered features. His lips pressed into a thin line, and his eyes glinted with something hard and unyielding. "Good," he said simply, his voice carrying the weight of a man who'd seen too much to mince words. He didn't deserve it, not after what he did. They sat there, the quiet wrapping around them like a blanket, the distant hum of the world fading into the background. Ryan's chest tightened as he glanced at his father, pride swelling within him for the old man's resilience, his refusal to bend under the indignity he'd suffered. "Dad," he said at last, his voice firm but laced with emotion, "I meant every word I said in that room today. I needed them to serially see how far he went, how that kind of garbage has no place in our department, no place anywhere." David turned to him, his expression unreadable at first, but then a spark of warmth broke through gratitude, pride, something deeper than words could touch. "You stood up, son," he said, his voice softening but still carrying that edge of steel. You didn't let him wiggle out of it with excuses, calling it a slip-up like he wanted. You made damn sure they saw it for what it was, the truth. Ryan's gaze dropped to his hands, his shoulders tensing as the memory of his father's humiliation flared anew in his mind. The way he treated you, he began, his voice thickening. The way he thought he could just... He stopped, the words catching in his throat. But David reached over, resting a gnarled hand on his son's arm. You did right by me, David said quietly, his grip firm. And you did right by everyone else he might have hurt down the line. That's what matters. The night deepened around them, the stars pricking through the velvet sky, and Ryan felt the weight begin to lift, just a little. Justice had been served, not perfectly, not without cost, but it had been served. And in that moment, sitting beside the man who'd taught him what it meant to stand tall, he knew the lesson ran deeper than any badge or rule book. Power, unchecked, devoured itself in the end, and those who wielded it carelessly would always face the reckoning they'd earned. The evening air was thick with the hum of the city as David sat on the weathered porch steps, his calloused hands wrapped around a chipped coffee mug. The faint glow of the streetlights flickered across his lined face, casting shadows that seemed to carry the weight of decades. Beside him, his son Ryan leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring out into the quiet street where the last traces of daylight bled into the horizon. A heavy silence hung between them, broken only by the distant bark of a dog and the rustle of leaves skittering across the pavement. The conversation they just had churned in Ryan's mind, stirring a storm of emotions he could barely contain. It turns my stomach, Dad, Ryan finally said, his voice low but trembling with a raw edge. To think someone like that could hold so much power over you, over anyone else, because of some twisted idea in his head, that he could strut around like he owned the world, like he had the right to decide you didn't belong in a place as simple as that diner. It's sickening. His fists clenched, knuckles whitening as he pictured the scene. His father, a man of quiet dignity, reduced to a target by someone blinded by hate to see the truth. David's gaze drifted upward, tracing the faint outline of stars beginning to pierce the darkening sky. A bitter smile tugged at the corners of his mouth, the kind that spoke of pain swallowed and lessons hard-earned. Ryan, he said, his voice steady but laced with a weariness that cut deep. Men like that are not rare. They've been around as long as I can remember, and they'll keep showing up long after I'm gone. That kind of hatred doesn't just vanish when someone loses their authority or their badge. It's rooted deeper than that. It lives in the way they stare at you, like you've trespassed on their world just by existing. It's in the sneers, the muttered words, the assumptions they carry like a shield. Ryan's chest tightened, a flood of anger and helplessness surging through him. He could see it so clearly now, the way his father had been forced to navigate a world that too often refused to see him as equal. It's disgusting, Dad, he said, his voice rising with the heat of his frustration, that anyone could look at you or anyone and think you're less than human, just because your skin's a different shade. And what twists the knife even more is knowing that people like him, like that Stark guy, thought they could do it without a shred of consequence. They figured no one would care enough to stop them. His eyes burned with unshed tears, the weight of that truth pressing down on him like a physical force. David let out a slow, heavy sigh, the sound carrying the echoes of countless battles fought in silence. This world, Ryan, it's still got a long road ahead. Men like Stark, they wrap their hate in excuses. They call it just doing their job or keeping order. And too many folks are willing to nod along and look the other way. They're comfortable in their ignorance, cozy in their power, because it's easier to pretend nothing's wrong than to face the ugliness head-on. His voice hardened, tempered by years of standing tall against that very ugliness. Ryan turned to his father, his heart sinking under a mix of admiration and sorrow. I don't get it. Dad, how do you keep going? How do you face that kind of garbage every day your whole life and not let it break you? After everything you've done, everything you've sacrificed, they still try to tear you down. It's not fair. His words trembled, caught between rage and a desperate wish to shield the man who'd raised him. David's eyes narrowed, a steel resolve glinting beneath the surface. That's exactly why I don't bend, Ryan. If I let men like Stark make me feel small, if I let them decide where I can sit, Where I belong, then I'm handing them the victory they're chasing. I've seen too much for that. I've stood shoulder to shoulder with men who gave everything, friends who never made it home, brothers who deserved so much more than this world gave them. I won't dishonor them by bowing to hate, and I sure as hell won't dishonor myself." His voice was a quiet thunder, unshakable and fierce. Ryan nodded slowly, letting his father's words settle into him like roots finding soil. "You're right," he said, his tone softening but firm. "They deserve better. You deserve better. I hate that it's still a fight. I hate that you've got to keep proving you're a person over and over, when it should just be a given." His shoulders slumped slightly, the exhaustion of that reality seeping into his bones. David's expression softened, and he reached out, resting a steady hand on Ryan's shoulder. The warmth of that touch was a lifeline, grounding them both. "You did something today, son," he said, his voice gentler now but no less powerful. "You stood up. You made sure that man faced the music for what he did. And maybe, just maybe, that'll plant a seed. Maybe the next guy who thinks about treating someone like they're nothing will pause, will think twice, because of what you did. That's how it starts." Ryan took a deep breath, the cool night air filling his lungs as he absorbed his father's quiet hope. "I want to believe that, Dad," he said, his voice steadier now. "I want to think today mattered, that it'll ripple out and change something. But I know there are others out there, cut from the same cloth as Stark, waiting for their chance to pull the same nonsense." His jaw tightened, a spark of determination flickering to life within him. David nodded, his gaze solemn but unwavering. "And that's why we don't stop, Ryan. For every soul who's ever felt like they don't fit, for every person who's been told they don't belong, we keep pushing. We show them they're not alone, that they've got a place here, same as anyone. That's the fight. That's the justice worth chasing." His words hung in the air, a promise carved from years of resilience. The two sat in silence for a long stretch, the weight of their shared resolve settling around them like a mantle. The night deepened, the stars growing brighter against the velvet sky. The sting of injustice lingered, sharp and bitter, but so did the faint glow of triumph, of victory, hard won and fragile, but real. David glanced at his son, a small, genuine smile breaking through the shadows on his face. "You did me proud today, Ryan," he said quietly. "You showed the world that men like Stark can't just run roughshod over people. And as long as there are folks like you willing to stand up, maybe this world's got a shot at getting better." Ryan met his father's gaze, a swell of purpose rising in his chest. "Thanks, Dad," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "For everything, for showing me what it means to fight, to respect myself and others, to never let them grind me down. I won't forget it." His smile mirrored his father's, a quiet vow passing between them. David gave a slow nod, pride shimmering in his eyes. "Anytime, son, anytime." As they sat there, side by side, watching the stars wink into existence, Ryan felt the enormity of the battle ahead. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, but with his father's strength as his compass, he knew he'd keep going. Every step, every stand, was a testament to the dignity they demanded, a strike against the abuse of power that had gone unchecked for too long. Justice, he realized, wasn't just a moment, it was a legacy, built one day, one fight at a time. Meanwhile, across town, the sun dipped low over Midtown's bustling streets, painting the storefronts in hues of amber and gold. 16-year-old Malik Wright pedaled his bike through the fading light, his sweat-soaked jersey clinging to his lanky frame after a grueling basketball practice. The rhythmic creak of the chain and the faint burn in his legs were familiar comforts, grounding him after hours of drills and laughter with his teammates. Malik was no show-off, just a kid with a quick grin, a gift for sinking three-pointers, and a mind that unraveled math problems as deftly as he dodged defenders. His friends dubbed him the Wiz, a nickname he wore with quiet pride. He steered toward the corner store, the promise of a cold sports drink pulling him forward. The neighborhood buzzed around him, food trucks hawking tacos, boutique windows glowing with neon signs, the chatter of pedestrians weaving through the evening rush. Malik parked his bike outside the shop, the faint wail of a police siren drifting past in the distance. It barely registered. Midtown was safe enough, and cop cars were just part of the scenery. He pushed open the door, the bell jingling overhead as a rush of air-conditioned relief washed over him. Grabbing a bottle from the cooler, he nodded politely to the cashier, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a warm smile, who'd rung him up a dozen times before. Outside, though, the air shifted. A police cruiser rolled up, its red and blue lights pulsing faintly against the store's grimy windows. Malik stepped out, drink in hand, and bent to unchain his bike, his mind already on the ride home. But a voice cut through the hum of the street, sharp and commanding. "Hey, yow, hold it right there." Malik froze, one sneaker poised on the pedal, his pulse kicking up a notch. He turned slowly, meeting the gaze of a white officer in his mid-40s, all stern lines and mirrored sunglasses that hid his eyes. "Me?" Malik asked, keeping his tone even, though a flicker of unease curled in his gut. The officer stepped closer, his boots thudding against the pavement. "Yeah, you," he said, adjusting his glasses with a deliberate flick. "What are you doing here?" His hand hovered near his holster, casual but pointed, a silent warning. Malik's brow creased, confusion warring with the instinct to stay calm. "Just buying a drink," he said, lifting the bottle slightly. "Is something wrong?" His voice was steady, but inside, his thoughts raced. What had he done to draw this kind of scrutiny? The officer's lips twitched into a smirk, cold and humorless. "That your bike?" he asked, nodding toward the sleek frame Malik had saved months to upgrade. "Looks a little pricey for someone like you." The words landed like a slap, sharp and loaded, cutting deeper than Malik wanted to admit. He straightened, meeting the officer's stare. "Yeah, it's mine," he said, his voice firm despite the churn in his stomach. "My dad got it for me." He refused to shrink, even as the weight of those words, "someone like you," echoed in his ears. A dry, mocking chuckle escaped the officer. "Your dad, huh? Let me guess, is a landscaper, maybe sanitation." The taunt was lazy, predictable, but it still stung, a jab at the life Malik knew his father had fought to rise above. Malik's jaw tightened, but he held his ground. "No, sir," he said, his tone clipped but controlled. "My dad's the mayor." The truth hung there, a quiet defiance he wielded like a shield. For a fleeting moment, the officer's smirk faltered, a crack in his armor before it snapped back into place. "Yeah, right," he scoffed, his voice dripping with disbelief. "ID." Now, his hand extended, expectant and unyielding. Malik reached for his wallet, his fingers steady despite the eyes he felt boring into him from every direction. Passers-by slowed, their glances lingering, some curious, some wary, a few sympathetic but silent. He handed over his school ID, the name Malik Wright printed bold and clear, a name that carried weight in this town if anyone bothered to notice. The officer took it, studying it behind those mirrored lenses, his face a mask of stone. "Stay right here," he ordered, turning toward his cruiser with the ID in hand. Malik stood rooted to the spot, the bottle sweating in his grip, the evening breeze doing little to cool the heat rising in his chest. He wasn't just angry, he was tired, bone-deep exhausted by the unspoken rules he was forced to navigate, the assumptions that clung to him like shadows he couldn't shake. As the officer muttered into his radio, Malik's mind drifted to his father, the mayor in a suit. But the man who'd taught him to ride that bike, who'd cheered at every game, who'd told him stories of his own fights against men like this. Justice, Malik thought, wasn't just about winning, it was about refusing to let them rewrite who you were. And as the officer turned back, his expression unreadable, Malik knew one thing for sure: he wouldn't let this moment define him. Not today, not ever. "It seems like your message got cut off, but I'll respond based on what you've provided." Tense, dramatic scene where Cruiser Malik, the mayor's son, is being questioned by Officer Daniels about a supposed stolen bike. The situation escalates with a crowd forming, phones recording, and a senior officer, Lieutenant Harris, stepping in to challenge Daniels' actions. Malik stands his ground, leveraging his composure, evidence, and the public's attention to turn the tables. "If you'd like me to continue the story, analyze it, or respond in a specific way, e.g., as Malik, Harris, or even Daniels, just let me know. For now, I'll assume you want a natural continuation of the scene." Officer Daniels shifted his weight, his eyes darting between Lieutenant Harris and the growing crowd. His earlier bravado was crumbling under her icy stare. Ma'am, Tu was just following protocol. We've had reports of stolen bikes, and he matched the profile. Profile, Harris interrupted, her voice sharp enough to make Daniels flinch. She held up the crumpled letter, the mayor's seal glinting faintly in the sunlight. This is the mayor's son, Daniels. A kid with a signed letter from City Hall, standing next to a bike that lets be Honslooks, like half the bikes in this city. You call that a profile? Daniels opened his mouth, then closed it, his hand twitching toward his radio as if it could save him. The crowd was buzzing now, a mix of whispers and bold voices chiming in. That's ridiculous, someone muttered. Kid didn't do anything, another added. The phone stayed up, capturing every second. Malik watched it all unfold, his heart still thudding, but his face a mask of calm. He could feel the shift. Daniels was on the ropes, and Harris wasn't letting up. She turned to Malik briefly, her eyes scanning him for any sign of distress. You sure you're okay? She asked again, quieter this time. Yeah, Malik said, his tone steady. I'm good. Just want to get out of here. Harris nodded, then faced Daniels again. You've got no evidence, no witness, and no reason to hold him. This stop was baseless, and you know it. What you should be doing is apologizing to this young man. But I'm guessing that's not in your playbook. Daniels' face flushed deeper, his jaw working like he was chewing on words he couldn't spit out. I was just doing your job. Harris cut in. Your job doesn't include harassing citizens without cause. Hand me your badge number. We're going to have a long talk about this back at the station. The crowd erupted in murmurs, a few people clapping as Daniels reluctantly recited his badge number. Malik caught the flicker of defeat in the officer's eyeshed overplayed his hand, and now he was paying for it. Harris scribbled the number down, then handed Malik back his ID and the crumpled letter. You're free to go, she said, her voice softening just enough to show she meant it. And Malik, tell your dad Lieutenant Harris says hello. He'll know who I am. Malik gave a small nod, tucking the papers into his backpack. Will do. He glanced at Daniels one last time. The officer's smirk was long gone, replaced by a mix of anger and embarrassment. Malik swung his leg over his bike, feeling the weight of the crowd's eyes on him. He didn't say another word. He didn't have to. The phones, the whispers, the senior officer stepping in it was all the victory he needed for now. As he pedaled away, the adrenaline finally hit, his hands trembling slightly on the handlebars. He'd won this round, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Daniels wouldn't let it go so easily. Not with that look in his eyes. Malik took a deep breath, the words from his dad's note echoing in his mind. Keep leading by example. Yeah, he thought. That's exactly what I'm going to do. Let me know if you want to tweak this, dive deeper into a character's perspective, or take it in a different direction. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cracked pavement of the quiet street, where a small crowd had gathered, their murmurs buzzing like restless bees. Officer Daniels stood at the center of it all, his uniform crisp, but his confidence unraveling. His hands fidgeted at his sides as he tried to string together an explanation, his voice stumbling over itself. We've been getting reports of stolen bikes around here lately, and this one just it matched a vague description we had. His words faltered, weak and unconvincing, as his eyes darted toward the sleek black bicycle leaning against Malik's leg. The teenager stood motionless, his posture relaxed, but his dark eyes sharp, taking in every detail of the scene unfolding before him. He didn't need to speak. The weight of his silence said enough. Lieutenant Harris stepped forward, her boots clicking sharply against the asphalt, cutting through Daniels, stammering like a blade. Her voice was low but carried an edge that made the air feel heavier. Matched a vague description, or was it something else entirely? Maybe you just didn't like the way Malik looked standing there with it. Her words weren't just an accusation, they were a spotlight, illuminating the unspoken tension that rippled through the onlookers. The crowd shifted, some nodding in quiet agreement, others exchanging glances of disbelief. A woman near the front shook her head, her lips pressed tight, while a man in a faded jacket muttered something under his breath, his hands stuffed deep in his pockets. They'd seen this before too many times, and the frustration simmered beneath their collective gaze. Daniel's face flushed a deep crimson. the color creeping up his neck as he struggled to hold onto what little authority he had left. "Ma'am, I was just doing my job," he protested, his voice cracking slightly, betraying the nerves he couldn't hide. He glanced at the crowd, their phones raised like silent judges, recording every stumble, every misstep. The weight of their scrutiny pressed down on him, and he shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his polished boots scuffing the ground. Harris took a deliberate step closer, her presence towering despite her average height. Her eyes locked onto his, unyielding. "Your job," she said, her tone slow and deliberate, "is to protect and serve this community, not to harass a teenager over some half-baked assumption. Don't think for a minute that I'm blind to what's really going on here." Her words hung in the air, sharp and undeniable, and Daniel's composure slipped further. He opened his mouth to respond, but all that came out was a weak, "I didn't mean anything by it," muttered under his breath as he cast a nervous glance at the growing circle of onlookers. Their faces were a mix of anger, exhaustion, and quiet triumph, and he could feel the heat of their judgment searing into him. Harris wasn't having it. "Oh, you didn't mean anything by it," she snapped, her voice rising just enough to make him flinch. "Tell that to Malik. Tell that to every single person standing here watching this mess unfold." She swept her arm toward the crowd, where phones glinted in the fading light, capturing the scene for the world to see. "Because you just turned this into a spectacle, officer. A real show." Daniels shrank under her words, his shoulders hunching as if he could disappear into his uniform. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, a low hum of agreement threading through them, and he shifted again, his discomfort palpable. But Harris wasn't finished. She turned to Malik, her movements precise as she handed him back his ID and a crumpled piece of paper, his proof of ownership, carelessly dismissed by Daniels moments earlier. Then she faced the crowd, raising her voice to carry over the restless chatter. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. The situation is being handled, and I assure you, there will be accountability." Her gaze flicked back to Daniels, a pointed look that pinned him in place, and a few people in the crowd clapped softly, their approval rippling through the air. Others nodded, their expressions a mix of relief and lingering skepticism. Malik still hadn't spoken, his silence a quiet storm brewing beneath the surface. He didn't need to say anything. Hers was taking charge, dismantling the officer's flimsy excuse piece by piece. But deep down, Malik wondered if it was enough. The sting of being singled out still burned, a quiet ache he couldn't shake. Harris stepped closer to him, lowering her voice so only he could hear. "Malik, do you want to press charges? It's your right, and I'll back you up." Her tone softened, but her eyes held a fierce determination. Malik hesitated, his gaze drifting to the crowd faces he recognized from the neighborhood. People who'd known him since he was a kid, then back to Daniels, who stood like a man awaiting sentencing. Inside, Malik's mind churned. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was bigger than one bad stop, one shaky excuse. It was about every time someone like him had been judged before they'd even opened their mouth. He could feel the weight of that truth pressing against his chest, urging him to act. But instead of answering Harris, he reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing against the cool metal of his phone. He pulled it out, dialed a number, and pressed it to his ear. Harris frowned, her brow creasing. "Who are you calling?" she asked, her curiosity tinged with impatience. Malik met her gaze, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "My dad." The crowd fell silent, the air thickening with anticipation as the line rang. Daniels seemed to shrink even further, his hands twitching at his sides, while Harris raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. On the other end, a familiar voice picked up, warm but edged with concern. "Malik, what's up?" his father asked. Malik took a slow breath, his tone calm but firm. "Dad, we've got a situation." Daniel's face paled, the weight of those simple words crashing down on him like a tidal wave. Harris crossed her arms, her sharp eyes darting between the teenager and her subordinate, waiting to see how this would play out. "Hang tight," Malik's father said, his voice steady through the phone. "I'll be there in 5 minutes." Malik ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket, his movements deliberate. He looked at Daniels, then at Harris, and said simply, "Now we wait." The air grew heavy, charged with an electric tension that pulsed through the crowd. Malik leaned against his bike, arms crossed, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the officer's growing unease. Daniels fidgeted, his eyes flicking to the phones still trained on him, their tiny lenses capturing every bead of sweat that dotted his forehead. Harris stood like a sentinel, her posture rigid, her gaze never wavering from the man she'd just reprimanded. The minutes stretched on, each one an eternity for Daniels, who kept glancing at Harris as if she might throw him a lifeline. She didn't. The crowd had swelled, drawn by the drama unfolding on this otherwise ordinary street, their whispers weaving a tapestry of speculation. Then, the low hum of an engine broke through the silence, and a sleek black sedan rolled to a stop at the curb. The back door swung open, and out stepped Mayor Gerald Wright, his presence commanding the scene like a thunderclap. Dressed in a tailored navy suit, he adjusted his tie with a practiced hand and strode forward, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. The crowd parted instinctively, their murmurs fading into a hushed awe as they watched him approach. Daniels stiffened, his hand drifting to his belt as if it could shield him from the storm about to break. Malik straightened, his expression neutral, but his eyes glinting with a message only the officer could read. "You're in deep now, Malik," the mayor said, his deep voice steady but laced with an undercurrent of steel. "Are you okay?" Malik nodded, meeting his father's gaze. "Yes, Dad. I'm fine." Mayor Wright turned to Harris, who extended her hand with crisp professionalism. "Mayor Wright," she greeted him, "I apologize for the situation. I arrived just as things were escalating." The mayor's eyes narrowed slightly, his tone cutting through the air. "Escalating." He shifted his attention to Daniels, who was now visibly sweating despite the cool autumn breeze rustling the leaves overhead. The officer opened his mouth to speak, but the mayor silenced him with a raised hand, his gesture sharp and final. "I'll get to you in a moment, officer," he said, his words landing like a gavel. He turned back to Harris, his expression unreadable. "Lieutenant, would you mind explaining why my son was stopped in the first place?" Harris didn't hesitate. The officer claimed he was investigating a potential bike theft, but there was no real evidence to justify the stop. Malik provided identification immediately. She shot Daniels a look that could have cracked stone. "I've already made it clear this was unacceptable." The mayor nodded slowly, processing her words, then finally turned to Daniels. "Officer Daniels," he said, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority, "would you like to explain yourself?" Daniels stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Like the lieutenant said, there've been reports of stolen bikes in the area, and I thought." The mayor cut him off, his tone rising just enough to make the officer flinch. "You thought what, exactly? That my son, walking out of a store with a drink in his hand, looked like a thief? Or was it something else about him that caught your eye?" Daniel's face burned a deeper red, his words crumbling. "I wasn't profiling anyone, sir," he muttered, but the lie hung limp in the air, fooling no one. The mayor stepped closer, his towering frame casting a shadow over the officer. "Don't insult my intelligence. My son didn't deserve this public humiliation. Not your baseless suspicion. No one does. And since you seem incapable of grasping that, let me spell it out for you." Daniels swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing as he stared at the ground, wishing it would open up and swallow him whole. "This isn't just a mistake," the mayor continued, his voice sharp and unwavering. "It's a failure of character. You put my son in a dangerous position today for no reason. Do you have any idea what that could have led to? Not just for him, but for you, for this department, for this entire city?" The crowd stood silent, the gravity of the moment sinking into their bones. Daniels said nothing, his eyes glued to the pavement, his silence an admission of guilt he couldn't escape. The mayor turned to Harris, his tone softening but still firm. "Lieutenant, I trust you'll ensure this is documented and handled properly?" Harris nodded without hesitation. "Yes, sir. Officer Daniels will be placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation." The mayor gave a curt nod, satisfied. "Good. Let's make sure this never happens again." He placed a hand on Malik's shoulder, his touch steady and grounding. "Let's go, son. You've got nothing more to prove here." But Malik didn't move. Instead, he turned to the crowd, Then back to Daniels, his voice ringing out clear and strong. "You're lucky I stayed calm," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "because this could have ended very differently for both of us. Next time, think before you act." Daniels didn't respond, couldn't respond. The weight of Malik's words, the unblinking cameras, and the mayor's towering presence left him mute, a man stripped bare by his own actions. As Malik and his father walked toward the sedan, the crowd began to thin, the tension finally easing like a storm passing over. But the lesson lingered, heavy and unshakable, etched into the air they all breathed. Malik's jaw tightened as they reached the car, his mind replaying every second of the encounter with officers' shaky accusations, the crowd's quiet outrage, the sting of being seen as less than he was. His father's hand squeezed his shoulder again, a silent recognition of the strength it took to stand tall through it all. "Malik," the mayor said softly as they paused by the car, "I need to know how you're feeling about this." Malik turned to face him, his expression calm but resolute, a fire flickering in his eyes. "I'm okay, Dad, but this isn't just about me. You saw what happened. That officer didn't stop me because of the bike. He stopped me because of how I look." The mayor's face grew somber, his nod slow and deliberate. "You're right, and I'll make damn sure this doesn't get swept under the rug." His voice carried a promise, a vow forged in the heat of the moment, a reminder that justice, when wielded carelessly, could cut both ways, and that the consequences of power misused would always demand a reckoning. Malik shook his head, his voice trembling with a quiet fury as he spoke. "This isn't just some isolated thing, Dad. It happens every single day to kids like Mekids who don't have a mayor for a father. Kids who don't get news vans pulling up or crowds cheering them on. What about them? Who's fighting for them?" His words hung heavy in the air, sharp with the weight of a truth he'd carried for too long. The city streets buzzed faintly beyond them, a distant hum of life that felt both close and unreachable, as if it were mocking the injustice he'd faced. The mayor, his father, let out a slow, weary breath, his broad shoulders slumping for a moment under the burden of his son's question. He stared down at the cracked pavement beneath his polished shoes, the lines on his face deepening as he wrestled with the reality of it all. Then, lifting his gaze, he met Malik's eyes with a mixture of pride and sorrow. "You're asking the question that keeps me up at night, son," he said, his voice low but firm. "And I swear to you, we're not just going to sit here and let it keep happening. We'll do something real." Before Malik could respond, before he could even process the flicker of hope his father's words sparked, a sharp voice cut through the tension behind them. "Wait, hold on." They both turned, startled, to see Lieutenant Harris striding toward them, her boots clicking against the asphalt with purpose. Her face was a storm of emotions, determination warring with a guilt she couldn't quite hide. She stopped just short of them, her hand fidgeting with the badge pinned to her uniform as if it suddenly felt too heavy. "Mayor Wright, Malik," she said, her tone steady despite the faint tremor in her hands. "I need to say this in person. Thank you for how you handled this mess today. And I'm seriously sorry on behalf of the department. This should never have happened. Not to you. Not to anyone." Malik studied her, his dark eyes narrowing as he searched her face for cracks in her sincerity. He saw it there, the regret shimmering in her gaze, but it wasn't enough to soften the fire burning in his chest. He crossed his arms, his posture rigid, and asked, "What happens now?" His voice was blunt, cutting through the air like a blade, demanding more than just words. Harris nodded, as if she'd been waiting for that exact question. "We're launching a full investigation into Officer Daniels' actions," she said, her words deliberate. "Not just him, though we're tearing into our policies, top to bottom. New training programs are already in the works, ones that tackle the biases we've let fester for too long. It's not a magic fix, Malik. It won't undo everything overnight, but it's a step forward." She paused, her jaw tightening. "And it's not enough, you know that." Malik's lips pressed into a thin line, his arms still crossed as he absorbed her words. "A step isn't enough," he shot back, his voice low but laced with a raw edge. "Kids like me don't get steps. We get ignored or worse." "I agree," Harris said quickly, surprising him with the force of her conviction. "That's why I'm asking Yalbeth of you to work with me, not just to fix the department, but to shake up this whole community. Malik, you've got a voice now, and people are listening. If you're up for it, we could use you to push for something bigger." Her eyes locked onto his, steady and unyielding, daring him to step into the fight. Malik froze, caught off guard by the offer. His mind raced, a tangle of doubt and possibility. He glanced at his father, who stood beside him, silent, but watching with a quiet intensity. The mayor gave a small, encouraging nod, his expression saying more than words ever could. "This is your moment. Think about it." Harris added, her voice softening but still firm. "And again, I'm sorry for what you went through today. I'll make damn sure Daniels faces the consequence, doesn't get to walk away from this." As Harris turned and walked off, her silhouette fading into the crowd, Malik felt a storm of emotions churning inside him. Relief flickered briefly, overshadowed by a deep, simmering frustration, and beneath it all, a spark of something new, something fierce. He looked at his dad, his voice quieter now but no less resolute. "You think she's for real?" "We'll find out," the mayor replied, his tone measured but laced with determination. "But you're right, this isn't just about today, it's about every day. If you want to turn this into something more, this is your shot." His father's words settled over him like a mantle, heavy but empowering. Malik nodded slowly, the weight of it all sinking into his bones. He didn't want to just brush this off, to let it fade into the background of his life. He wanted he needed to make sure no one else had to stand where he'd stood, staring down the barrel of unchecked power. He yanked open the car door and slid inside, his mind already spinning with ideas, plans, dreams of something better. Officer Daniels had tried to shrink him, to strip him of his dignity, but instead, he'd lit a fuse, and Malik wasn't about to let that fire die out. As the car pulled away from the curb, Malik pressed his forehead against the cool glass of the window, watching the crowd thin out in the rearview mirror. The city stretched out before him, tall buildings casting long shadows, streets winding through neighborhoods rich and poor, faces of strangers flickering past. This wasn't the end of anything, he realized. It was the start of a reckoning. The ride home was silent, but it was a silence thick with purpose. Every block they passed, every glimpse of life outside, hammered home why this mattered. He wasn't just another teenager in this sprawling urban milieu, was the mayor's son. And with that came a duty he couldn't turn away from anymore. His father's voice finally broke through the quiet, warm and steady. "You held yourself together out there better than most grown men could have, Malik. I'm proud of you for keeping your head up." The praise landed softly, but it stirred something restless in Malik's chest. "Thanks, Dad," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it's not enough. It's never enough." His eyes stayed fixed on the world outside, the blur of concrete and color reflecting the chaos in his mind. The mayor sighed again, a sound heavy with understanding. "You're right. What happened to you today, what happens to kids like you all the time, it's wrong. It's unjust. But fixing it, that's a long road, son. It takes time, and it takes a plan. You've got the heart for it, Malik. Now we've got to figure out how to use it." Malik turned to face him, his brows knitting together as frustration bubbled up. "Use it how?" "Words don't cut it, Dad. Apologies don't cut it." That officer could have, his voice cracked, and he stopped, turning away to hide the sting of tears he refused to let fall. The memory of Daniel's smug face, the cold grip of fear, flashed through him like a jolt. The mayor reached over, resting a firm hand on his shoulder. "You're angry, and you've got every damn right to be. But anger alone, it burns out if you don't give it a purpose. You want to stop this from happening again. Then we do it together. We make it right, not just for you, but for everyone." Malik looked back at him, his expression hard but searching. What do we even do?" His voice was a challenge, a plea, a demand all at once. The mayor's eyes narrowed, glinting with a resolve that mirrored his son's. "We use what we've got. My position, your story. We push the police department third, not just for some half-baked training, but for real accountability. We make sure people hear what happened to you loud and clear, so they can't look away." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a fierce whisper. "This isn't just about justice for you, Malik. It's about tearing down the systems that let this happen in the first place." Malik leaned back in his seat, letting the words sink in. Daniel's face swam into his mind again with arrogance. The moment it faltered when he realized who Malik was. It wasn't enough to see him punished. Malik wanted that smugness wiped out for good. For every kid who didn't have a mayor to call dad. Harris said she wants me involved, he said after a long pause, his tone cautious. You think she's serious? His father tilted his head, considering. She seemed like she meant it. But even if she doesn't, we hold her feet to the fire. This can't be some publicity stunt, it's got to be real, or we make it real. Malik's jaw tightened, a steely resolve settling over him. Then let's do it. Let's make it real. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of a vow. The mayor's lips curved into a faint, proud smile, his eyes shining with something unspoken. That's my boy. We'll sit down with Harris tomorrow. For now, try to rest. You've been through hell today. But as the car rolled into their driveway, Malik knew rest was a distant dream. He stepped out into the cool night air, the stars above faint against the city's glow, and made a silent promise to himself. This wasn't about settling a score or proving a point, it was about dismantling a machine that crushed people under its weight. Later that night, he sat at his desk, the dim light of his lamp casting shadows across the room. A speech draft his father had given him that morning lay in front of him, its neat lines of inspiration feeling hollow now. He grabbed a pen, his hand trembling with urgency, and started writing. The words poured out, messy and fierce, transforming the speech from a feel-good pep talk into a battle cry. It wasn't just about leading by example anymore, it was about demanding action, about holding power to account, and Malik was ready to step into the fray. The next morning, he sat at the kitchen table, his untouched plate of eggs growing cold as his mind churned with plans. His father had left early for City Hall, leaving Malik to prepare for a meeting with Harris. The phone rang, jolting him from his thoughts. Mr. Wright, a crisp voice said on the other end. This is Channel 7 News. We'd like a statement about yesterday about Officer Daniels. We hear you were involved. What do you have to say? Malik's heart thudded in his chest. This was his chance, his platform. I'll give you a statement, he said, his voice steady despite the nerves. But listen close. What happened to me isn't just my story, it's a pattern. Kids like me get treated like this every day. And most don't have anyone to back them up. We can't keep letting it slide. The reporter hesitated, then asked, You sure you want to go public with this? Dead sure, Malik replied, no trace of doubt in his tone. This isn't just news, it's a wake-up call. I'm not the first, and I won't be the last. But maybe we can change that if we start holding people accountable. Got it, the reporter said, a note of respect creeping into her voice. We'll spread the word. Thank you, Malik. The call ended, and he sat there, adrenaline coursing through him. There was no going back now. He grabbed his jacket and headed out, the crisp morning air biting at his skin as he made his way to the community center. The sun was just breaking through the clouds, casting a tentative light over the world as if it, too, was waiting to see what came next. Inside, Harris was already there, huddled with a small group of activists and local leaders. Their eyes turned to him as he stepped into the room, a mix of curiosity and expectation hanging in the air. Malik, glad you made it, Harris said, waving him over to the table. We've been hashing out what's next. Her voice was brisk, but there was a warmth there, a flicker of hope. Malik sat down, taking in the faces around him, tired, determined, scarred by their own battles with the system. He felt the weight of their stares, but it didn't shake him. I've been thinking, he began, his voice steady and clear. I don't want this to be a one-off. What happened yesterday, it's bigger than me. It's about justice, about consequences. And I'm not here to just talk about it. I'm here to make it happen. The room hung heavy with silence, every pair of eyes fixed on Malik as he stood at its center. The weight of their expectations pressing against his chest. He could feel the tension coiling in his stomach, a mix of nerves and resolve. But his voice didn't waver as he broke the stillness. If we're serious about fixing this, he said, his tone deliberate, we can't let it fade away like some fleeting headline. This isn't a what-I'm flare-up we can ignore. We need change, real, enduring change that sticks. The air seemed to shift, his words sinking into the minds of everyone present, each person leaning in, waiting for more. Malik's gaze swept the room, taking in the face some weary, some hopeful. all marked by years of frustration with a system that too often failed them. The way I see it, he continued, his voice gaining strength, this isn't just about tweaking police policies. It's bigger than that. It's about rewriting the rules for how the world treats kids like mechkids, who get stamped with a label before they even get a chance to prove who they are. We've got to make sure that when something like this happens, it doesn't just get buried under excuses or forgotten in a filing cabinet. We need accountability that bites, transparency that shines a light into every corner, and real trust between the people in these streets and the ones sworn to protect them. Across the table, Harris leaned forward, her elbows resting on the polished wood, her brow furrowed in thought. She nodded slowly, her eyes locked on Malik's, a silent signal of agreement flickering in her expression. "And how do you think we get there?" she asked, her voice steady but curious. Inviting him to lay out his vision, Malik met her stare without hesitation, his jaw tightening with determination. "We start with a youth advisory board," he said firmly. "A group of young people working hand in hand with the police department, tackling the biases, the profiling, the mistreatment head-on. We need to guarantee that kids, especially black kids, have a say in how they're seen, how they're treated. Our voices can't just be whispers in the wind, they've got to carry weight." A quiet hum of approval rippled through the room. Pens scratched against notepads as a few people jotted down his words, their heads nodding almost unconsciously. Malik felt the shift had them now, their attention locked on him like a spotlight. And it's not enough to stop there. He pressed on, his passion spilling into every syllable. "We need workshops for the police, not just some half-baked training sessions, but raw, honest conversations. They've got to sit down and face how their actions ripple through our neighborhoods, how their split-second judgments can leave scars that don't heal. They need to see that their biases aren't just thoughts, they're weapons, and they've got to answer for the damage they do." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle, then added, "And we can't forget the kids. We need outreach programs, real ones that pull young people in. Give them something constructive to hold onto. Teach them that the police aren't just a threat to dodge, that the system can be more than a machine chewing them up. Show them it's supposed to shield them, not break them." A community leader, his graying hair catching the light, leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping thoughtfully against the table. "You're talking about tearing it all down and starting over," he said, his tone measured but intrigued. Malik didn't flinch. "That's exactly what I'm saying," he replied, his voice ringing with conviction. "We can't just slap a bandage on a wound that's been rotting for decades. This isn't about quick fixes, it's about healing, deep and lasting. And that only comes with real, gut-level change." Harris rose to her feet then, a slow smile spreading across her face, softening the sharp edges of her usual no-nonsense demeanor. "I think we've got something solid here, Malik," she said, her eyes gleaming with admiration. "This is the kind of leadership we've been starving for." A surge of pride swelled in Malik's chest, warm and electric, as her words washed over him. This wasn't just a fleeting victory, it was a turning point, a chance to chart a new path where the kids coming up behind him wouldn't have to claw their way through the same battles he had. As the meeting wound down, the room buzzed with energy. Community leaders and activists huddled together, their voices overlapping as they hashed out logistics, names, dates, first steps. Malik slipped outside, the afternoon sun spilling over him in golden waves. He stood there for a moment, breathing in the crisp air, his mind already racing ahead to what came next. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, he felt the tide turning and he was ready to steer it. In the days that followed, the city pulsed with a new rhythm. Word of Malik's story hissed runnin' with Officer Daniels. His bold stand at the meeting spread like wildfire through the streets and social feeds, igniting debates in barbershops and living rooms alike. He wasn't just the kid who'd been roughed up anymore. He was a spark, a force setting things in motion. The Youth Advisory Board took shape almost overnight, its first meetings crackling with urgency as young voices, some timid, some defiant, laid bare the realities they faced. Malik stepped into his role naturally, guiding the discussions with a fire that burned steady and bright, his vision for a better future cutting through the noise. The police workshops were another beast entirely. The air in those rooms was thick with tension, officers shifting uncomfortably in their seats as facilitators pushed them to confront their own prejudices. Malik didn't attend, but he heard the story show. Some cops bristled at the questions, while others sat in stunned silence, grappling with the weight of their own actions. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary, and bit by bit, the conversations chipped away at the wall between the badge and the block. At City Hall, the mayor threw his weight behind Malik's ideas, his deep voice booming through council chambers as he demanded transparency, accountability, oversight. Words that had long felt hollow but now carried a new edge. The council members, a mix of old guard skeptics and younger idealists, listened as he painted a picture of a city reborn. Some resisted at first, their arms crossed and lips tight, but Malik's sincerity, his refusal to back down, wore them down. Even Officer Daniels, the man whose heavy-handed stop had set all this in motion, couldn't escape the fallout. Suspended and sent to retraining, he sat through sessions on racial sensitivity. His broad shoulders slumped as he wrestled with the lessons. Word trickled back to Malik through mutual friends that Daniels was struggling, his confidence shaken. A flicker of pity stirred in Malik's gut, but it was quickly overshadowed by a harder truth. This wasn't just about one man's mistake. It was about a system that had let those mistakes fester unchecked. One bright Saturday afternoon, Malik found himself on the steps of City Hall, a microphone trembling slightly in his hand as he faced a swelling crowd. The square stretched out before him, packed with plea teenagers with homemade signs, parents with tired eyes, elders leaning on canes, all united under the spring sun. He took a deep breath, the scent of fresh-cut grass mingling with the nervous sweat on his palms, and began. "We all deserve to feel safe," he said, his voice steady despite the knot in his throat. "No matter what we look like, no matter where we're from. But too many kids like me wake up every day having to prove we're not trouble, that we're not a threat to be crushed. This isn't just about fixing the police, it's about rewriting how this world sees young black men. We're not defined by our skin or our streets. We're bigger than that, stronger than that." The crowd stirred, heads nodding, a few hands brushing away tears. Malik felt his father standing just behind him, a quiet pillar of strength, his presence a lifeline in the sea of faces. "Officer Daniels messed up," Malik went on, his tone softening but resolute. "Badly. But this isn't just about him, it's about a system that let it happen, that made it easy for him to see me as less than human. We need accountability, not just from the ones in uniform, but from all of us. We've got to believe change isn't a pipe dream, that we can bend this world into something better." The applause hit him like a wave, crashing over the square as voices shouted his name, signs thrusting into the air with slogans like "Justice for Malik" and "Change starts here." Emotion surged through him, a dizzying blend of hope and responsibility. "We're not finished," he called out, his voice rising above the roar. "This is just the starting line. We're going to keep pushing, not just for me, but for every kid who's ever been stopped, hassled, judged before they could even speak. We won't stay quiet. We won't step back. We're the future, and we're here to demand what's right." The rally ended in a swell of purpose, the crowd buzzing with a unity Malik could feel in his bones. His father caught his eye, offering a small, proud nod, and Malik knew this was only the first chapter. As he stepped away from the podium, the cheers trailing him like a shadow, it hit him. This wasn't just about new rules or reforms. It was about shifting souls, about proving to a watching world that young black men were more than the stereotypes pinned to their backs. Malik was determined to show them every step, every word, every fight, and he wasn't stopping until they saw it too.